Um, well, welcome everybody. I'm Jeff Pasley, Associate Director of the Kinder Institute, and welcome to our, we were going to call it the Baseball Lock-In, Baseball Law and Society Lock-In, but now today the university's on remote operation, so we're locked out, just like baseball itself. To be honest, this whole session originated in my realizing that I've always been a big baseball fan, and also as a sort of side reader of scholarly books on baseball and society. Just noticed that we had a couple of people connected to the Kinder Institute and the EMU History Department who were doing scholarly, who were either working on scholarly aspects, doing scholarly work on baseball, or had in the past. So I thought it would just be a fun session to, especially since this should have been the time when, despite the fact there's a foot of snow on the ground, that should have been about the time that the baseball season was, at least the pitchers and catchers were reporting. So that hasn't worked out. Being in the same space together hasn't worked out. But I hope we can still talk about baseball law and society today for a fun change of pace. And I hope you've all got yourself a good chair. Maybe opened up a beverage of whatever your choice, of water or whatever you want to do, and join us today for a wide variety of takes on baseball, law, and society. So we have three guests today, each of whom we're going to talk about around 20 minutes. And then we can turn it into a bit of a free-for-all at the end, and you should feel free to submit questions as we go along. And I will also say that we're definitely experiencing some technical difficulty with the connection, with one of the connections involved. So we'll hope we can get that worked out by the time it's his turn to speak. So we have three guests today. Tommy Bennett, Thomas B. Bennett, who's an associate professor and Wall Family Fellow at the University of Missouri Law School and joint appointment with the Kinder Institute. And Tommy's a 2012 graduate of NYU School of Law, and before that, Swarthmore College. Tommy's got some very extremely erudite work, that the whole research program on modern day judiciary. But what the reason we're interested in having Tommy talk today was in his previous life as a baseball statistician, where he was a columnist for 2 years for Baseball Prospectus, and I think a bunch more stuff actually than even is on his CV. Because a person doesn't necessarily always put every detail of their past lives on their CVs, and this is only the 2-page version that I've got in front of me. But Tommy's a recent addition to the faculty. I think Tommy, you've been here 2 years, and I think I've encountered you in person like twice. Because of this, despite having talked to you a lot because of this. Because of our various COVID problems. We've also got a first year MU law student, Alexis Brudnicki, who also has a very long and distinguished, very long, not very long, she's obviously quite young, but not, still has a rather lengthy career as a baseball journalist before she came to Missouri Law School. She came out of University of Western Ontario, where she's still working on apparently a doctorate in educational leadership, but was the beat writer for the Toronto Blue Jays and a writer for a number of baseball publications, including one I subscribed to for years, Baseball America, where She had so many bylines, I couldn't even get to the end of them looking this up today. Alexis, thank you for this was I knew about Tommy's baseball past. I didn't know about Alexis, so I'm glad to have Alexis share some more modern perspectives. And then providing his phone, we can get his connection to work. We have MU Ph.D. candidate Japheth Knopp, who's it's DJ Eddie Sniffer Fritz. Sorry, I was seeing something on the screen and remembering something. Japheth is finishing up a dissertation on baseball in the Black community in Kansas City. Something he's been working with me on. Started out working on the Negro Leagues specifically. It's kind of expanded into a sort of larger study on baseball in the East Side of Kansas City, which of course is where not only where the Kansas City Monarchs played, but where the municipal stadium and the original home of the Kansas City A's and Royals were as well. So Japheth is just, we've got Tommy's going to do, we got Tommy on modern, Tommy on modern on the law of baseball, Alexis, I think, on sort of baseball policy in the present day, and Japheth some of the history of it. So I think I will turn it over to them, and we decide to go in alphabetical order. So that means Bennett comes first. So Tommy, over to you.
I'm sorry we couldn't do the game of the bat to see who went first, but I'm gonna see.
There's a lot of things we should have thought of. This whole being online thing is just messes a person up, and I obviously should have said play ball. That's right.
That's right. Let me. I'm gonna try and spotlight my video so that I can show some slides. So let's see. Can everybody see and hear well enough what I've got here? Okay, so I'm going to use these just to kind of illustrate things as I talk. But I'm so glad to be part of this great panel, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Alexis and Japheth have to say. I think it's going to be really great, and thank you to Jeff for that great intro and for organizing this panel. I wanted to talk today about a really important case from the United States Supreme Court that has to do with baseball. And it's probably familiar to many of you who have some familiarity with the law, which is called Flood versus Kuhn. And it's remembered today as the case that reaffirmed baseball's exemption from federal antitrust laws. But I think it's got a larger relevance. And part of the reason I wanted to talk about it today is because this is the 50th anniversary of the issuance of Flood versus Kuhn. So I'll talk a little bit about that case for those of you who aren't familiar with it, and then I'll try to put it in historical context and update that case's legacy for the present day. And so Flood versus Kuhn, as I said, it was decided in 1972, and it itself reaffirmed a 50-year-old precedent that had first established baseball's exemption from federal antitrust laws. So in 1922, there was a case called Federal Baseball Club that first declared baseball exempt from federal antitrust laws, namely the Sherman Antitrust Act and the Clayton Antitrust Act. And of course, today, as we approach the 50th anniversary of Flood itself, and baseball's owners, Major League Baseball teams' owners, are continuing the league's first labor lockout in more than 30 years. But I think, as I said, Flood has a lot of lessons that it can teach us today about not just baseball, but also about important trends in the law and the way that the path of the law is developing. So just to give a little bit of background on what was going on in Flood versus Kuhn, since baseball became a serious business, they had adopted a form contract between every team and its major league players. And that contract was known as the Uniform Player Contract. And the most notorious part of this form contract was paragraph 10A, which is more frequently known as the reserve clause. And I'll see if I can just put it up on the screen here. I've summarized and edited it down a little bit so you can get a sense of what's really going on here. But the basic gist of it is that if a team and a player do not agree on a contract, the contract gives the club, the team, the right to renew the player's contract for a period of 1 year on the same terms as had existed in the prior year. And I just want to note a little bit of legal ambiguity in this phrase. You can't ask a law professor to talk about a contract without him wanting to talk about some of the ambiguity in the language. And so that's what I'm going to do. If you look at the underlined part of the text here, let's see if I can point in the right direction. I'm like 50-50 on that. Okay, so if you look at the underlined language right here, you can see that the contract allowed for the team to renew the contract for the period of 1 year. Now, you may think, oh, easy, 1 year, right? Well, the question became, what happens in the second year if the team and the player still cannot agree on a contract? Does the team have an additional option and an additional option and so on and so forth forever? In other words, did the reserve clause give teams a perpetual option on their player services, or was it just a one and done option? And the predominant view, the view that had prevailed in practice, was that it gave teams a perpetual option on their player services at the same price they had paid them the first year that they failed to agree upon a contract. But it's not necessarily the only reading of the contract. So as we'll see, one of the major lawyers and negotiators for the leagues had identified this very ambiguity as a source of concern when they were getting ready to litigate whether this reserve clause was enforceable. So John Guerin, the negotiator for baseball, who had been a longtime negotiator for newspapers against unions in their labor negotiations, had taken this language to the lawyer for the National League and said to him, listen, I've read this clause, and as I read it, it gives the team the option to renew a player's contract for 1 year, and that's it. And the lawyer for the National League, who was a senior partner at the White Shoe Wall Street law firm, Wilkie Farr and Gallagher, he looked at it and said, don't ever let them try that renewal clause. And so as a legal matter, the reserve clause was not on as sure of ground as the practice on the ground might have suggested. But that was indeed the way things went for a very long time. The reserve clause was understood to grant teams a perpetual option to renew their player services. And it effectively barred players from becoming free agents, and it barred players from negotiating with other teams to try to increase their salaries. Okay, so that's the reserve clause. Another piece of background that's important to know here is the way that the interpretation of the United States Constitution's Commerce Clause has developed over time. So let me see if I can put that one up on the screen. Okay, again, I've edited it down. It's much longer than this. It's part of Article 1, the part of the Constitution that delimits and grants Congress's powers. And the text is obviously underdetermines the meaning of the Commerce Clause because it's quite short indeed. It just says that Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce among the several states. And you could tell an entire history of federalism in the United States through the twists and turns of the Supreme Court's interpretation of this portion of the Constitution. And as relevant here, before 1937, between about 1875 and 1937, the predominant view of the Commerce Clause was rather restrictive. In other words, the Supreme Court consistently held that Congress did not have the power to regulate commerce that was two things: not actually commerce and not actually interstate. And that's really important. So let me just break those down one at a time. The Supreme Court today effectively has held that Congress has very wide latitude to regulate interstate commerce, but that was not always so. In that prior era, before the New Deal, the Supreme Court required that the activity being regulated really be commerce. And that's to be distinguished from all kinds of pre-commercial activities, things like manufacturing, mining, other kinds of preparation or creation of goods before they were put into the stream of commerce. And so it had to be commerce as opposed to those pre-commercial activities. The other thing that is relevant here is that today, Congress can regulate any activity that has a substantial effect on interstate commerce. But before 1937, the Supreme Court required that the activity to be regulated have a direct effect on interstate commerce. It was not enough, the Supreme Court had consistently held, if the activity had only an indirect effect on interstate commerce. And so in 1922, when the Supreme Court was sued by independent Major League Baseball team that had been part of an independent major league called the Federal League, they defended their activities against an antitrust suit on the grounds that they were not engaged in interstate commerce, which would be required in order for them to violate the antitrust laws, which set their limit at the same place that the Constitution sets the Commerce Clause limits. In other words, they could only be sued successfully if they were engaged in interstate commerce. And their argument was, listen, we run baseball games, and yes, sometimes we have to travel across state lines in order to hold those baseball games, but the activity that we're engaged in, the playing of baseball games, that's a purely local activity, and it doesn't involve interstate commerce. It doesn't have a direct effect on interstate commerce. Any effects that it does have are indirect at best. You come to the ballpark, you buy a ticket, you get your peanuts, you get your Cracker Jacks. All of that is purely local commerce, and so we can't possibly be engaged in interstate commerce. And in a unanimous opinion written by then Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court agreed with baseball and said that baseball was immune from antitrust suit in virtue of the fact that it was not engaged in interstate commerce. And that is what we might call the narrow precedent that existed about whether baseball was subject to the antitrust laws. But if we look at a larger scope in time and we look beyond baseball itself, we can see that the law shifted very quickly away from the understanding of commerce that obtained in that federal baseball case. In 1937, famously, the switch in time that saved nine, as it was famously called, the Supreme Court dramatically expanded its understanding of the scope of the Commerce Clause. And gone were those fine-grained distinctions between commerce on the one hand, things like manufacturing and mining on the other. Gone was the requirement of direct effects as opposed to indirect effects. Now, just about any effect on interstate commerce would be enough, according to this new Supreme Court, in order to bring the activity within Congress's power to regulate. And so just 15 years after that initial case of federal baseball was decided, it looked like a serious anachronism, disconnected in time and disconnected in doctrine from the new way of thinking about Congress's powers. And so it wasn't long before people thought it was time to challenge once again the precedent in federal baseball and ask the Supreme Court to subject baseball to the federal antitrust laws, just like it had subjected every other major sports league to antitrust laws. And that's exactly what happened when Curt Flood, a star center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals, was not able to agree on a contract with the St. Louis Cardinals on the terms that he wanted. He had made it his goal to be paid over $100,000 per season, which at that time was kind of a mark of professional and financial success. And the owner of the St. Louis Cardinals was not willing to go that high for Curt Flood, notwithstanding the fact that Flood himself had been a 12-year veteran with the Cardinals. He was an all-star and a sensational defensive center fielder. He was on the cover of Sports Illustrated in 1968, which declared him the best center fielder in baseball, which was a no mean feat when Willie Mays was still patrolling center field for the Giants. And so he was a real star with a tremendous amount of talent. But of course, this was a different era at which point in time stars had much less power than they do today. And after the 1969 season, the Cardinals and Flood, well, really just the Cardinals unilaterally parted ways with Flood. And they traded him to the Philadelphia Phillies as part of a package trade. And they informed him of his trade. The assistant GM of the Cardinals informed Flood of the trade by telephone and by a written letter delivered to his home. That was all the consideration they gave to Flood when they asked him to uproot his life in St. Louis, which he had been building for more than a decade, and move to Philadelphia. He had developed a side business as a portrait painter and a photographer. He was apparently quite good at it. The owner of the Cardinals, Gussie Busch, actually hung a portrait that Flood had painted of Busch on in the, I guess it's the saloon of his yacht. Would that I had a yacht big enough to have its own saloon, let alone a baseball player to paint portraits of me in which I could hang in it. But that's the quality of the connection that Flood had forged with the city of St. Louis. And so he was not eager to uproot his life and move to Philadelphia. And so he joined a long heritage of baseball players who engage in labor strife because they simply refused to play for the Philadelphia Phillies. Napoleon Lajoie in 1902 tried to sign with the upstart American League Philadelphia Athletics and move away from the Philadelphia Phillies. And it took an opinion from the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania to tell him that he could not do so. And of course, J.D. Drew, more recently in the 1990s, was drafted by the Philadelphia Phillies and decided he'd rather play independent ball for a year than have to play for the Phillies. So Flood was just part of a long line of people who thought it would be lousy to play for the Phillies. And I say, as a Phillies fan, I can't really blame him. The Phillies of the late 1960s and early 1970s were truly execrable. When the Cardinals ended up trading Steve Carlton to the Phillies, he said he wanted publicly to win, I think it was 30 games. The Phillies only won 59 games that year. 30 of them were won by Carlton. So a very bad team with lots of reasons why you wouldn't want to play for them. And so Flood said to the head of the Major League Baseball Players Association, the baseball union at the time, Marvin Miller, a legendary labor figure, that he'd like to sue the league. And Marvin Miller said, "You bet, we are behind you 100% of the way." And you can see Miller here on my slide, and you can see Flood next to him. So Miller hired just about the best person you could hire for the job. He hired Arthur Goldberg, the former Supreme Court Justice and longtime labor lawyer for United Steelworkers Union, where Marvin Miller himself had previously been an employee. And Goldberg was then a partner at the fancy New York law firm Paul Weiss, and Goldberg agreed to take on the case. They tried it to a trial in the Southern District of New York, the sort of fancy federal courthouse in Manhattan, which you can actually see Flood standing in front of in the photograph on the slide. And they lost at trial. They sought a preliminary injunction to keep Flood from having to begin playing for the Phillies when the next season rolled around. That motion was denied. They sought an expedited trial. And the trial itself was kind of a spectacle. You had a sort of a starring lineup of witnesses, including Jackie Robinson, Hank Greenberg, Bill Veeck, Marvin Miller himself, Bowie Kuhn, the commissioner of baseball, and for a little comedic relief, Joe Garagiola also testified at the trial. So it was quite a spectacle. But ultimately, because of the precedent in cases like federal baseball, the district court ruled in favor of baseball, and Flood was out of luck. But of course, a fancy lawyer like Goldberg was not content to stop at the trial court. He was going to appeal it up all the way. So they took it to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, where they also lost, although they were able to draw upon some favorable statements from judges on that court, including Learned Hand, probably the most celebrated non-Supreme Court judge of the 20th century, who said that he thought, in his view, in an earlier case, that it was obvious to him that baseball was engaged in interstate commerce. Similarly, Jerome Frank, the law professor and legal realist before he became a member of the Second Circuit, had declared that the Supreme Court's recent decisions have completely destroyed the vitality of federal baseball and have left that case but an impotent zombie. Frank had a certain way with words, I think. And so they thought they had a chance at the Second Circuit, but the Second Circuit too thought it was bound entirely by the Supreme Court's precedent in federal baseball. And that left only one place for Flood to go next, which of course was the Supreme Court. The Flood and his lawyers petitioned for certiorari, which the Supreme Court granted in 1971. And they heard argument in the case. It was between two very able lawyers, Goldberg on the one side, as I said, for Flood, and Paul Porter, the longtime baseball lawyer and the name partner of the Washington white shoe law firm Arnold and Porter, represented the league. And the case was argued and assigned to Justice Harry Blackmun to write the opinion. And Blackmun was new to the court. He was actually part of a new wave of justices that had joined the court. Richard Nixon, in his slightly more than 5 years in the White House, got a chance to appoint 4 members of the United States Supreme Court, of which Blackmun was the second. And Blackmun was a little bit of a wild card at that time. People didn't know exactly what to expect of him. But one thing was certain about Blackmun: he was an enormous, almost rabid baseball fan. And he took the assignment to write the opinion in Flood versus Kuhn very seriously, but there was no doubt that he was going to rule in favor of the league and hold that baseball was still exempt from the antitrust laws. It's important to stop here and note the larger context, which I'll come back to in a minute, but the basic history at this moment in time was that the court had agreed to hear Roe versus Wade in 1971, and it would actually end up getting argued twice. But all of this is against a backdrop of a court that is being rapidly reshaped by the Nixon administration, even as it's considering these very high-profile legal issues. But the opinion that Justice Blackmun wrote relied almost entirely on the doctrine of stare decisis, which is a fancy lawyer's Latin for the idea that questions that have been decided by previous courts ought to be answered in the same way in the future, and that precedent ought to be respected. And so on this theory, the court said, because the court had already decided the question of whether baseball was exempt from the antitrust laws in federal baseball, precedent dictated that the same result obtained in Curt Flood's case, and that he would not be able to overrule that precedent. It's important to note here also that this doctrine of stare decisis has traditionally been applied by the Supreme Court in a kind of super strong fashion when the court is interpreting statutes as opposed to the Constitution. Now, that might seem odd to you, that it would be harder to change the judicial interpretation of a statute than to change the judicial interpretation of the Constitution. But at least the idea behind the distinction is that, in theory, Congress can change the interpretation of statutes, and that once a court has decided how a statute should be interpreted, they sort of think the ball is in Congress's court. And so Justice Blackmun's opinion for the court rested on this theory of stare decisis and this super strong version of it that applies when they're interpreting statutes, as they were in Flood's case, the federal antitrust statutes. But the thing that everybody remembers about Justice Blackmun's opinion in Flood versus Kuhn is part 1 of his opinion, which he titled "The Game." And I'll just put some of the highlights of what people have said about this part of his opinion on the slide in a second. So we have one writer called it "over 700 astonishing words of editorial ranting." Another called it "indefensible as a matter of fact or policy," and an embarrassment to the court. And the Yale law professor Bill Eskridge called it "the most frequently cited example of excessively strict stare decisis." So not a popular a piece of work product by Justice Blackmun. And the reason why it's come under such scrutiny is because it reads more like a purpley paean to baseball. He named 83 Hall of Fame baseball players and chose to celebrate those baseball players and their role in history. He forgot Mel Ott, much to his later chagrin, but everybody else he remembered watching and listening to as a child, he included in the opinion. And it didn't seem entirely related to the legal question of whether baseball was exempt from the federal antitrust laws. I'll just add one other minor point here, which is that part of what the Commerce Clause is designed to do in our constitutional order is to draw the boundary between federal power and state power. And so one thing you might infer from the fact that Congress lacks the power under the Commerce Clause to regulate certain type of activity is that therefore it is automatically left to the states to regulate that same activity. But in his opinion for the court, Justice Blackmun very quickly brushed aside any idea that states had the power to regulate baseball under the antitrust laws, because to do so would be to interfere with Congress's prerogative to regulate interstate commerce. So in other words, even though the original premise of federal baseball was that Congress couldn't regulate baseball under the Commerce Clause because it wasn't engaged in interstate commerce, The Flood Court reaffirmed that decision while declaring that states couldn't regulate baseball because baseball was engaged in interstate commerce. And so poor baseball players were caught whipsawed between this changing interpretation of the Commerce Clause. Now, just to wrap up and give some historical context, as I said, the conditions in baseball and the law were changing very quickly during 1972. So between the time that Flood was argued and decided, baseball's union declared its first labor strike, which lasted a little under 2 weeks. Meanwhile, as I said, the composition of the Supreme Court was changing rapidly, and the court was struggling with whether and how to decide Roe versus Wade in light of its new personnel. And of course, Blackmun, if you're not familiar, Blackmun was the author of Roe versus Wade. It forms an important part of his legacy on the court. On the baseball side of things, Marvin Miller, the president of the MLBPA, eventually did succeed in getting rid of the reserve clause, but he had to do it through the use of the arbitration agreement that he had convinced the teams to insert into the uniform player contract. So when the arbitrator cites issued his famous decision granting free agency to Messersmith and McNally, effectively the reserve clause was doomed for the very reason that I discussed earlier, namely that the reserve clause only grants a one-year option, not a perpetual option. And today, baseball still has an antitrust exemption from all of the federal antitrust laws, and it fights like mad to keep that issue out of the courts so that courts aren't faced with the question of whether to overrule not just federal baseball, but also Flood versus Kuhn. But today, the Supreme Court is very much interested in revisiting its past precedent. A forthcoming study in the Columbia Law Review by Berkeley Law professor Tejas Narachania has found that the Roberts Court, more than any other Supreme Court, is especially interested in hearing cases that ask it to overrule precedent, including this term, notably a case that challenges the precedent in Roe versus Wade. And yet, despite these many opportunities to overrule Flood and federal baseball, the court has shown no interest in doing so. I'll just close with a sort of epigraph from Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court Justice, who wrote the original opinion in federal baseball that I think speaks well to whether his own precedent should be followed. He wrote that it's revolting to have no better reason for a rule of law than that it was laid down in the time of Henry IV. It is still more revolting if the grounds upon which it was laid down have vanished long since, and the rule simply persists from blind imitation of the past. So I think at the occasion of Flood versus Kuhn's 50th birthday, it looks worse than ever as precedent and as principle for how the federal government and the state governments relate to one another. And I think we can see that very clearly in the labor strife in baseball today. I look very, very much forward to the comments of my co-panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. Thank you. Thank you. That's a lot to think about. We'll turn it over to Alexis next. But first, I forgot one of Alexis's. I forgot in the introduction to Alexis. I forgot a key accomplishment, which I always hate. So I actually had found this, that she just is the 2021, we always do awards in academia, so Alexa should get an award too, or at least we're very into awards. She is the winner of the 2021 Bob Elliott Media Recognition Award from Baseball Canada, and has a very nice Twitter poster on here that I think I don't want to interfere with the karma of this. Of our connection here to try to put up, but congratulations on that, Alexis, and over to you now.
Thank you. Yes, I'm very, very proud of that. I am obviously not working in baseball media currently, so it was very lovely, I guess, like Christmas present to be awarded that honor for 2021. And I know you gave me an introduction. I should say a little more. Also should say how difficult it is to follow up Professor Bennett. I do not have a slideshow, and that's just not how I operate. But hopefully we can manage together anyway. And if anyone has questions along the way, I'm happy to take those too. But I will first kind of explain a little bit. I am a first-year law student at Mizzou. I did spend the last 11 years working in the baseball industry. I am Canadian, so all of my other degrees are Canadian. So I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Western Ontario, and then I did a sports journalism graduate diploma program at Centennial College in Toronto, which is when I started working for the Toronto Blue Jays. And I ended up as a statistician and scoreboard operator for the Toronto Blue Jays. I worked for them for 8 seasons, but it was seasonal. So in between, I also worked in the Australian Baseball League. I worked for Baseball Canada as well as a press officer for the women's national team. I got to go to Mexico, Japan, kind of a bunch of places with them. I've covered baseball on 4 continents in 7 different countries. I've been very fortunate to do that. I then did my master's degree through Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario in assessment and evaluation. So I focused on scouting. I also went to Major League Baseball's scout school. I really had my sights on getting into scouting and going in that direction. And then I started my doctorate of educational leadership, where I began focusing on the policies that I will get to here, hopefully very quickly. And I worked for Major League Baseball at the same time. So before I came here to law school, I was working for Baseball America. And prior to that, I was working for Major League Baseball. And this upcoming summer, my 1L summer, I will be working in the commissioner's office for the commissioner, deputy commissioner, and their legal counsel as a legal intern in New York. So I came here thinking I was leaving baseball, and I was wrong, as I am a lot. I've come to learn that. I mean, I feel like Professor Bennett put that quote up there. I'm sure I've gotten the review on my stories before that I've written like 700 astonishing words of editorial ranting myself. So that is not new for me, but I'm just happy to kind of be here and be a part of this. But I know I was brought to this panel to talk a little bit about policy and what I have been proposing. So as you mentioned, I have done 2.5 years of my doctorate, and now I'm in law school. So that's a little bit on hold. We'll see how that goes. I just received approval of my dissertation proposal over the winter break. So I'm still working on it, and it'll happen eventually. But my educational focus there has been on sexual harassment in baseball and policies that baseball should and hopefully will consider to improve in that area. And I will say this is a very personal issue for me. One of the experiences that I had in baseball before I left working for Major League Baseball was that I went through an investigation with the organization. They did bring in outside legal counsel to conduct the investigatory process. And I will say that I learned a lot from that process, and it has had a huge impact on the work that I've done and the research that I've been doing. So it is very personal to me. It is very important to me. I can't really say that I'm unbiased in this area, so I won't lie and pretend that I can be. But what I have proposed to baseball, and I am working through it academically with my dissertation, but I also wrote a version that was slightly less academic to take to Major League Baseball. So I went to New York in September, and I wrote this lengthy proposal using research based on other industries and areas that I thought baseball could draw from to look at addressing policy gaps, creating additional pathways for victim assistance, providing resources for education and training, and to offer advocacy to anybody who reports. So those are the areas that I have narrowed my focus to, and that I think are just a starting point. This is just a very kind of base level introduction to where changes can start, because baseball has a long way to go. There is a lot of room for improvement. So I guess the first area for me was just addressing policy gaps. I did work for Major League Baseball full-time as a full-time employee for a couple of years, but for the first 9 years of my career in baseball, I was a freelancer, whether it was as a journalist or a statistician or a communications professional. And as a freelancer, I think I got to see where a lot of the gaps are. I just wasn't protected. I didn't have an HR department I could go to. I didn't really have individual bosses who were attached to any of the entities that the problems were coming from. So it was a very difficult area to try and kind of connect. And also it's very scary. I mean, I'm a woman in baseball, which is definitely becoming, I don't even want to say more of the norm now, but there are more women now, thankfully. Still not enough to make it close to any kind of norm. But it's really hard. It's very scary. I mean, number one, everyone in baseball is very scared for their job, whether you're the president of a team or the left fielder or somebody who works in PR. You can lose your job tomorrow. They have tons of people waiting in line who are ready to step into that role, who are ready to get paid less than you, who are ready to do it for free or anything that they ask. A lot of people want to do those jobs. So it is not secure. So that is very intimidating right off the hop. And I really missed an opportunity there to say right off the bat, this shows how this is going to go for me. But so it's just a very intimidating environment. There are not a lot of places to go, not a lot of people to go to, and not a lot of people who understand the situation. I, at the time, 10 years ago, didn't have other women I could go to. There weren't people I could ask. The people I did ask didn't have the answers because they didn't know other women who'd been in the same positions, or they just didn't have that understanding or those resources because they didn't exist, or they didn't exist on a large enough scale to get to them. So those policy gaps have been very important for me. Working at Major League Baseball, when I did have an HR department and I did have bosses to go to, although that had its own set of issues and problems, it still helped me recognize where those gaps are. There were a lot of articles last year about women reporters, and just right off the start, who do they go to? Do they go to their bosses at The Athletic or at the New York Times or at the New York Post, or who do they talk to? Do they talk to people with the team? So for me, it was hard to see the connections again. And so I proposed that even the policies that Major League Baseball has in place, they extend to anyone who interacts with their employees. So not just for their employees, but anyone who interacts with their employees, whether that be players, coaches, staff members, just so that there are outlets for those people to go to and possibilities for them to have an extra layer of safety or resources. I also proposed additional pathways to promote victim assistance. And I will say this one is a little fuzzier legally. I did propose this to Major League Baseball in September, 1 month into my law school adventure here. So I'm not a lawyer yet. I cannot make this legally sound, especially on my own. But the thing that I asked for and continue to ask for is an ombuds program. Whether or not you're employed by a company or you're not, they have HR departments, they have legal departments. And I think the general gist of what I was trying to get to is that those departments serve the organization. So whether it's Major League Baseball and it's their HR department or their legal department, they serve Major League Baseball. And I'm asking for an ombuds program to serve the people who may be coming forward, so that people may have an understanding or a belief that someone has their best interests at heart. I know when I went through the investigation that I went through, I didn't have any of these things. I didn't have any assistance. I didn't have any help. I didn't have any pathways. I didn't have an ombuds program, but I do think it would have helped. I do think it would have made a difference. And that is something I would love for other people to have, is just someone who has their interests, whether or not I was told the investigators or the deputy commissioner or the people I was speaking to had my interests. I still knew who they worked for and who they were trying to protect and what their jobs were to do. And so I want to see additional resources for people. And then I did also propose to them further education and training tools, in particular bystander intervention training. I did talk to several teams individually as well about different training that they do with their, whether it's their scouts or their staff or their other people. And Major League Baseball did promise me that they're starting to do this. And I think a good way to get there is to start with some climate surveys, which is not something they had yet implemented when I worked there, and my tenure with them came to an end 1 year ago. So unless they've made some significant changes within the last year, I would say they probably still don't have those in place, but they did commit to them. I will say they did commit to all of these things, which is a good start. But so I would like to see some climate surveys to lead into the training that is needed and an understanding of where training is needed. So there is a lot of inconsistency now. Some stuff happens, it doesn't happen over and over. And I think it could, and I think it could happen in different ways. And then the final piece that I proposed to them was to offer advocacy to anybody who reports. I know going through the investigation that I went through, I was pretty confident. I understood how these things work. I understood some of the pitfalls and the dangers, and I kind of had an understanding of what I thought my rights were. I knew the people involved. I knew the facts were on my side. I did receive a favorable outcome, and it was still a terrible process. It was unbelievably stressful. It was demeaning. It was everything bad you would think that anything like this would be. And I had everything going in my favor. I speak English as a first language. I just was thinking constantly about the people who don't have maybe even any of those things in their favor. So for me, advocacy was very important. I will say Major League Baseball my investigation took 91 days, and on day 87, Major League Baseball did get me a lawyer. So that was great on day 87, 88, 89, 90, 91. And that also helped me realize how important that advocacy was. It just gave me an entirely new, renewed sense of confidence and protection that I had not felt up until day 91. I really thought even the things that they had told me for sure were going to happen, that they could just change their mind at any time. I didn't believe them. I had no trust in the process, no trust in the system. I had seen the stories from other women. I had heard behind the scenes experiences from other women. And so I had very little sense of trust and confidence in the process, and having an advocate was very helpful to me in that area. She also is the person who suggested that I even write a policy proposal to Major League Baseball, and she met with Major League Baseball along with me, which I felt was very, very helpful to propose these policies. And so Major League Baseball did agree to implement all of these changes and these policies in September. They did say that we would get to it after this CBA is negotiated. So we have yet to see changes, though they were not expected quite yet. But again, this is just like the bare minimum. I think this is where things start. And I would love to, hear from other people, answer other questions. And I know there are so many layers that go beyond this for future policies as well, which is why I am going to work for Major League Baseball this summer at least, and see if some positive change is actually possible or if this is just lip service. But these things are very, very important to me. I think probably a lot of people know that MLBPA and MLB introduced the joint sexual assault, domestic violence, and child abuse policy in 2015. And that is part of what it is being collectively bargained as well. And I don't think anything will change there, but I do hope that in the future, these kind of changes and additions and policies can begin to be layered, because right now there is kind of nothing happening. And so I would love to see something start to happen and then to build on that. And I am just appreciative of everybody's time here and happy to answer any questions. And I don't want to take up any more time. I'm very interested in hearing from Japheth as well. So I'm just happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Alexis. I actually had no idea there was sounds like I apologize for leaving out quite as much of your record as I did. So Japheth, is your connection going? Japheth, are you there?
See, can you guys hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you better.
Better.
Your visuals are maybe you should try just doing it audio only.
I'm gonna try stopping the video with
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Or maybe you get a picture of yourself you can throw in there or something.
Yeah,
I'm gonna say one more thing about you, Japheth. Don't you find yourself a still photo in you? Or we can just have people watching you. So Japheth, he's a graduate of Missouri State University in Religious Studies and MA in History. And the thing that I wanted to say about Japheth's record is that he's made a number of contributions before he even came to us, and while he's been here, he's made a number of contributions to scholarly contributions in a kind of slightly different sense than what he does here, to publications associated with SABR, the Society of American Baseball Research, on the topic he's working on, and other ones. He's a contributor to, I think there's another book that I'm forgetting, Japheth, but I know one that I've got is Bittersweet Goodbye, the Black Barons, the Grays, and the 1948 Negro League World Series. And I think there is at least one of those volumes you've contributed to. So well published already, and we're looking forward to what comes out of this dissertation that you're writing. So Japheth, if you're ready to have it turned over.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Yeah, the other book was From Rube to Robinson. It was sort of a greatest hits of SABR on the Negro Leagues. I felt really, really lucky to have been included with that. There was like 15 pieces, and the biggest names in baseball history were in there. And then there's me in there too. And that was a real treat. And I've got a piece in another anthology coming out in July on baseball tours of Japan. And my piece is on the 1981 Kansas City Royals and their tour of Japan. Before I get going, I would like to say that I just feel kind of lucky to be here today. I've been looking so forward to hearing the other panelists, and I feel like I'm just kind of lucky to be included with them. Those were wonderful talks. So what I would like to talk about today is the Kansas City Monarchs in the period of 1920 to 1948, and Kansas City's Black community in this time period. And we can use baseball as sort of a prism or a lens to look at what's going on more broadly in American culture at the time. And Kansas City, for reasons I'll get to in just a moment, makes just a wonderful case study. Some of the people are almost like they sent them from central casting. Just all of the pieces really line up when we get into Kansas City, which makes it a great model for looking more broadly. So I was looking at opening day of the Kansas City Monarchs in 1923, and the Monarchs had only been going for a few years, but they had started out as a very good team. About 10,000 people turned out to the pregame celebrations, not just to the game itself. By this point already in Kansas City, opening day for the Monarchs, especially in the 18th and Vine Black District, had basically become an unofficial holiday. Businesses closed, people took off work. The Black section of town shut down for opening day. Thousands of people would come out to a parade. You would have African-American booster clubs of different types, National Guard units, Boy Scout units, Elks clubs. The Monarchs themselves had like 6 different chapters of their fan club. Hundreds of people marching in the parade. Thousands of people would come out. And one thing that I was most struck by this early was that there's an account of Frank Cromwell, who was the Democratic mayor of Kansas City, throwing the first pitch to William Gordon, the Democratic mayor of Kansas City, Kansas, which the Kansas City Call, the main black paper, which I want to get into in just a moment a little bit more, referred to it as Cromwell throwing the ball somewhere near the plate. What was kind of stuck out to me about this was that this is 1923. This is, a decade before the traditional narrative of when we start to see democratic politics come into African-American communities. This is being challenged over the last several years, but I still think there's a lot of that traditional narrative of this came from the New Deal coalition with FDR and during the Depression. So what are 2 white Democratic mayors doing at essentially an all-black event? Well, if we look at Kansas City, but also more broadly, we start to see things changing a little bit quicker. And this entire period of the Great Migration, the interwar period, today we're putting it at 1920 to 1948 because those dates make some sense for us. But there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of things that are changing. And there's a few kind of major philosophical schools that are in competition with one another. So how this period is going to end, and what the role of baseball in that is, and what comes out of this really dynamic period of activity within these parallel Black-owned economies is pretty interesting. So to start with, Kansas City is sort of unique in that by the time we get to World War I, by the time we get to the Great Migration, there's already a substantial Black population in Kansas City. This was sort of atypical for a Midwestern or Northern industrial town. We don't typically see that in huge amounts until World War I. The reason why we have that in Kansas City earlier, how it starts anyway, late 1870s, 1880. Thank you.
You're welcome.
The Kansas Exodus, large numbers of African Americans with Ben Singleton are with Reconstruction just ending. The people that could get out decided that the getting was good. a lot of people got as far as Kansas City when the league ran out. And it happened in Kansas City that the major industries at the time, which mostly revolved around the railroads, meat packing, and to a lesser extent, metalworking, like smelting. These industries would hire African-American men to work there. These were generally the more menial jobs, but there were industries on industrial scale that would hire Black workers. So a lot of folks were kind of stuck there. There was work to be had. Word kind of gets around that if you're an African-American man, you can make your way to Kansas City, you can get a job. And why these aren't great jobs, there's enough, it produces enough capital to where we start to see a Black community with Black-owned businesses earlier than we see elsewhere. The first Black baseball teams get started in 1896 in Kansas City. It's the Kansas City Braves. So where a lot of cities are struggling and having racial tensions through World War I in the early 1920s, really revolving around large numbers of Black workers coming up. We don't see riots like that. We don't see the racial tensions to anywhere near the extent. Kansas City has a fairly developed, robust, mature Black community in place. When the first Negro Major League was founded, the meeting that set the meeting that set up the league took place in Kansas City. It was supposed to have taken place in Indianapolis. It was later moved to Kansas City. Placing a franchise in Kansas City was a major goal. It was seen as an essential market. You have a large Black population that's already fairly well settled. There is some money in this community. As we're going to talk about in just a minute, the 18th and Vine district of Kansas City is flourishing, both legally and somewhat illicitly. That will become Kansas City's sort of vice district as well. And Kansas City is also a major transit hub, a major rail net hub. So all these factors together would have made Kansas City an important place for this new league to put a team. Kansas City also has the only white owner in the Negro League, in the Negro National League. That's J.L. Wilkinson. He started life as a ball player. Turned out he wasn't good, but he was really good at keeping the books and booking venues and kind of making a show out of baseball. He ran several independent teams. These are teams that are professional, but they're outside of any league. They just traveled around playing whoever. He had one that was called the Bloomer Girls. That was an all-female team. And then in the 19-teens, he hit on a team called the All Nations that found stationed in Kansas City. And it was a completely integrated team, both gender, race, and that was sort of their gimmick. Is you had Hispanic, Asian, Black, white, Irish, all sorts of nationalities. There was a woman second baseman, but there was no all-Black team in Kansas City. So in 1920, what becomes Kansas City Monarchs to get a charter to be to start a franchise, and kind of based on the core group that was within his previous team, J.L. Wilkinson starts up Kansas City Monarchs. He had a very good reputation amongst other Black team owners as being somebody that wasn't going to rip you off, wasn't going to take advantage. He was also voted to be the league secretary. A lot of that was because it was felt that it would be good for the organization, for the league itself, to have somebody within their ranks that would be in a better position to negotiate for things like stadium access, to negotiate with white promoters over, what percentage of the gate visiting team have. To have a white businessman in that position was seen as advantageous. For the most part, when it came to being the public face of the team, he was content to let a man named Quincy Gilmore, who was the traveling secretary for Kansas City Monarchs, and comprised about 1/3 of the front office. These were small front offices. Like opening day, when they have this parade, they'd have team owners sitting in opening cars. It would be Quincy Gilmore that would be there instead of J.L. Wilkinson. Kind of kept himself more remote. Also, right around the same time in 1919, we have the establishment of the Kansas City Call, a weekly black paper in Kansas City, still publishing today. It will have a major national readership, especially in the American West. It publishes several different editions per week. There's a local, a national, one that's for Texas. And Chester Frayne, who is the owner and editor of the Kansas City Call, you see a few things routinely on the pages of the Call. One are headlines about uplift, about African Americans breaking down barriers, getting into new schools, or desegregating different workplaces, or the first black student to receive such and such scholarship. Just week after week after week, we see tons of that. We also see sort of some sensationalist accounts, especially when it comes to crime in the black community. So from Franklin's perspective, it's very much about uplift but also highlighting what's wrong in order to sort of, I guess, shame that out of the community, that they weren't going to, turn away from what was wrong, while really emphasizing the strength of the community. And what's interesting is that from the 20s through the 40s, in the sports pages of the Call, you see the same thing reflected. You see the same, whenever there is a new stadium that is desegregated, or another team that allows playing against a black club, a sport that allows black athletes or officials. So we see this pattern of black press spreading the word about racial uplift and progress that is being made. We see this mirrored in the sports sections. The Call's sports department often would embed sports writers with the Monarchs, especially during spring training. And so what they do is they'd go, these guys played year round. They played for Kansas City during the summer, and then were playing somewhere else, usually in Mexico or the Caribbean, during the winter. And then there would be spring training in the South, like this time of year, and then the season would start up again. And the Call would send writers to cover Kansas City Stars down in Cuba or the Dominican, and then come back with them and follow them around the American South during their spring training. So in effect, the sports editors and sports writers of the Kansas City Call are able to bring news about how Black people are being treated really around the Western Hemisphere, certainly through the United States. So yeah, they're reading about Satchel Paige and about their other star players and how well they're doing in the Dominican or how well they're playing in Mexico. But they're also getting these accounts of that there's not discrimination, that there isn't segregation, what social life is like in these places. And then when they come up to the South for spring training, there's instances and accounts of, stadiums having Klan members show up. And so it's through the sports pages that a lot of people in Kansas City are able to kind of keep up on what's going on in regards to African-American rights more broadly. What's it like in South America? What's it like in Mexico? What's it like in Georgia? And we're bringing that through the sports pages. Carol Anderson wrote a book a few years ago, kind of on the same thing, but about how Black papers were bringing international news about what was going on in decolonization from around the world to American readers. Similar sorts of things are going on within the Western Hemisphere and the rest of the United States through the sports pages, which I find interesting. So Kansas City's community by 1920 is fairly prosperous, but it's sort of a negotiated space. There's a lot of kind of intersectionality that's going on with it. A lot of that, the money coming in, is because Kansas City has a reputation, and Dr. Pasley's done a lot of work on this, as sort of a Vegas before Las Vegas. It was Paris of the Plains. It was this wide open town where sort of anything went, with jazz and with prohibition going, the speakeasies, brothels, and these underground jazz clubs. And that required business leaders within the Black community and civic leaders within white Kansas City as well. It requires the police turning a blind eye. It requires, protectionism from this. And that's going to bring us in a fellow named Tom Pendergast, who for decades controlled Kansas City's democratic machine, and how it incorporates the African-American community several years, to an extent at least, several years before we get to the New Deal coalition. There's this intersectionality where we find money being brought in Kansas City's Black community. It wasn't like, gambling and drinking is happening there, but it's the same few dollars being spread around. It is actively siphoning in dollars from the white community. A lot of people were sort of willing to turn a blind eye to these sorts of objectionable or questionable activities, so long it wasn't taking place in their neighborhood. And happening in the Black community was we can turn a blind eye to this. This is also important to the broader Kansas City economy as a whole. Kansas City for many decades was one of the major hubs for conventions, for different groups like trades groups holding their annual conventions. One reason is it's centrally located and right on several major railroad hubs, so it's sort of equidistant to a lot of people. It's something that the Chamber of Commerce, of course, spent a lot of time, effort, and energy on promoting. Some brand new arenas and convention centers were built in downtown Kansas City around this time. But it was also a place to play. That the conventioneers were usually talking about, professional men who are away from their families for several days, and they come to Kansas City where kind of anything goes, and they can run around and play. Now they're staying in nice downtown hotels. They're renting out the convention center. They're going to the nice downtown restaurants. But where are they going, for the nightlife? Is they're going to the 18th and Vine district, where you have the bordellos and the speakeasies and the jazz clubs and so forth. You have to have kind of a tacit understanding, at least, right? The one can't succeed without the other. Kansas City can't boast about how many conventioneers it does and bringing in all of these people and all of this money without sort of the less said about side. And those things go very much together. It's also in the 1920s that we start to see the 1920s. We do start to see African American voting bloc in Kansas City and a few other places start to align more Democratic. Again, kind of the conventional wisdom was this happens in the 30s with the New Deal coalition and FDR. It's really going on a decade or more before that. And this is, you can imagine how this would cause problems for the National Democratic Party, being as how in the South, it's still a white supremacist segregationist party. But you have in urban areas, you start to see guys like Tom Pendergast, these machine bosses, for whom African Americans and these new groups that are coming up with the Great Migration are seen as another ethnic enclave. They're another ethnic minority group like the Irish or Italians or Jews that come in and looking for work in the factories and in the meatpacking plants and set up in their own neighborhoods and need patronage and the social safety net that the party machine system brought with it in exchange for the votes, in exchange for these blocks of votes. So they, Pendergast and a few other machines, they start really courting the African American vote. By the time we get to the Great Depression, where obviously the economics for everyone was going downhill, disproportionately so in the Black community, we find that Tom Pendergast and the machine is starting to step in. Pendergast is able to sort of manipulate federal funding to where a lot of it goes through his hands first. And so when we see the distribution of federal aid for different projects, we see Black men are getting hired as well. That it's that the Black community is not being cut off from this aid and ostracized. By the end of this period, by the time we get into World War II and the 1940s, where we already have this nascent civil rights movement going on, what with the Congress for Racial Equality and the Double V campaign, and a lot of political pressure being put on using the narrative of the war, defeating fascism abroad to bring in more civil rights within the United States. Again, we see that in play itself out in the newspaper columns of the Kansas City Call and other Black newspapers. Jackie Robinson is not unique or alone when he comes in 1947 and breaks the color line. He kind of gets the most remembered. But between the end of World War II and 1950 or so, just about every major sport desegregates. We have in the NFL, basketball and tennis will by 1950. This is, of course, time of Joe Louis is just dominating boxing. We see the first Black jockeys since the end of the 19th century. We start to see the first referees and officials, Black officials, moving into sports like boxing. There was also, especially with baseball, a real unfair way in which integration took place. Major League Baseball still to this day, every year, likes to make a big deal on Jackie Robinson Day. Everybody wears 42. It's sort of the look at how historically progressive we have been. and that really kind of undercuts the point. A lot of Black players, when they went from the Negro Leagues into the major leagues, and Jackie Robinson was one of these, were just pirated. Their contracts were never purchased. Branch Rickey and other owners said that essentially the type of contracts that the Black leagues used weren't official for them, so they didn't have to honor them. Players' contracts that should have been worth tens of thousands of dollars, they went for peanuts or not at all. And as we're seeing integration and desegregation in this period, we are also seeing white flight and deindustrialization and decapitalization moving out of these urban areas. So we have this juxtaposition in baseball and elsewhere, where we have ostensibly society becoming less segregated, more integrated, but is that really the account on the ground? Is that really what is happening? In a lot of ways, we see the best players and the best workers kind of cherry picked out of the Black economy. We see less resistance for Black shoppers and consumers to just stick to the opportunities within their communities, because there has been some integration. But you also have these businesses that are much less capitalized, have a much harder time gaining capital, have a much smaller fan base to even start to work with. And so when Jackie Robinson comes in, that's really the Negro Leagues going out. And we stopped counting the Negro National and American Leagues as major leagues after 1948. They essentially become minor leagues and just sort of feeder teams for the major leagues. It didn't have to happen this way. They could have been incorporated as, an affiliated minor league, like a AAA. There were teams that had cities that had established Black teams, like Kansas City Monarchs, that had did not have a major league team. Those could have been. It was proposed and that we bring in a couple of all Black teams into the American and National Leagues. So it didn't have to happen this way, and it wasn't all uplift and a positive outcome, as the story of Jackie Robinson and integration sort of gets told and retold and sort of spun. And by the 1950s, we see in Kansas City, which again had this much longer history of having a vibrant Black community, we start to see what's happening there is what's happening elsewhere with white flight, decapitalization. Money is moving out of these communities while people are pretty well stuck there. The Kansas City Monarchs will get sold following the 1953 season. Kansas City gets a major league team with the Philadelphia Athletics move to Kansas City. The Monarchs get sold basically for the use of their name. They're still called the Kansas City Monarchs. They're out of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And they're essentially just a touring team and nostalgia. But a lot of folks within the Black community and that worked on baseball within the Black community end up losing their jobs, and there's way fewer Black men employed in baseball, say in the early 1950s, than there been in the 1940s when the Negro Leagues were still flourishing. And that's got to be about my time. I guess any questions, or I guess we're going to go to the panel discussion questions now, or that's kind of what I got. Dr. Pasley?
Excuse me, I was muted. Sorry, you couldn't hear me. I was saying, well, you could see what I was doing. You can see what I was
Yes.
doing, which is putting you guys on. Okay. So let's have questions. So I'm not quite as smart as I think I see. I was putting up those pictures, but then after a while I realized that I was just had the screen that I was sharing that I'd forgotten. I hope nothing. I hope it wasn't too distracting when I was like scrolling through looking for pictures of the 1922 Negro Leagues meeting and things like that. I was trying to keep ahead of you, Japheth, to see when you what you were going to be. So, what questions do people have for the panel?
Well, I appreciate that, sir.
Maybe the panel has questions for each other.
I had one question that I guess is primarily for Japheth, but it's something I'd be curious to hear what Alexis thinks about too. So I understand that many of the official record-keeping organizations have recently declared that Negro League statistics will be treated as Major League statistics, and that sort of retroactively the Negro Leagues will be deemed Major Leagues, which I think is overdue and welcome. But I wonder if that kind of new recognition for the Negro Leagues has changed any of the attention on the Negro Leagues or made it easier or more accessible to study the Negro Leagues in any kind of way?
Well, it's definitely a mixed bag. Part of the reason I chose the dates 1920 to 48 was those are the years that Major League Baseball says, okay, the Negro Leagues were major leagues, and that the players and managers all count in the statistics.
So you're using the retroactive date, Japheth? Okay, interesting.
Yeah, that's what baseball is set now, is 20 to 1948. And the whole thing is it's complicated and it's a little bit problematic. It's great that major leagues are addressing this issue. It's great that a lot of these players are getting the recognition that they deserve. But this idea that we just sort of retroactively say, all right, everybody was equal now, and all these records count. Well, the truth is the two sets of leagues were never equal, and that was systemic. They weren't supposed to be equal. They weren't set up equally. The Negro Leagues didn't have access to nearly all of the didn't have near the access that the white major league teams had to capital, to ballparks, to transportation, to accommodations. So to suddenly say, well, it's all the same now, and to put up all the statistics together as though it's a 1-for-1, that's just not reflective of what actually happened. And yes, it's making some statistics and things easier to find, like baseballreference.com, which is kind of the keeper of these things, have put up all the old Negro League statistics with the white major leagues. But when you look at them, it looks like these players played a lot fewer games. There might only be 40, 50, 60 league games per year, and that's the only thing getting counted. Well, these teams barnstormed, and they played a league schedule, but at the same time, they were playing minor league teams, local semi-pro teams, just about anybody that could bring in a little bit of gate. So they were playing 3 or 4 times as many games per year as the records would indicate. Also, when it comes to the white major leagues, you have the Elias Sports Bureau that had been taking down statistics and game summaries for over a century. The Negro Leagues never afford that. Even just going through old newspapers and trying to find this is difficult. The Kansas City papers, if you look at the Kansas City Star, these are nice. The microfilm, very clear photographs taken. You could tell the guy at the Photoshop really took their time, everything nice and neat, everything in focus. When you look at the Kansas City Call, same Photoshop. They were just like somebody just slapped it up on an easel, took the pictures as quick as they could. Things are out of focus, harder to read. And this seems to have not been an isolated incident. So if you go through the white newspapers, they're easier to find. Black newspapers are tougher to read. And a little bit of the statistics and how things are lost to time. A little bit of it is to blame on the teams themselves. Oftentimes you have a guy like Quincy Gilmore, a traveling secretary, who would go off with the teams and would send back to the newspaper accounts of road trips. But if the teams lost, they just wouldn't say anything and only would send in accounts of victories. And that was complained about at the time from sports readers. Sports fans complained even when that was happening. And it makes it harder for us to go through and have these gaps in game accounts. Mostly because they thought, well, we're not going to draw a lot of gate by talking about losing games. Wait until there's a winner or somebody hit a big home run or that kind of thing to put in the paper. So there's a little propaganda feel to it too.
Well, I mean, this is all baseball, right? I mean, so, because Barry Bonds and Roger Clemens are vanished somehow. So why shouldn't, it's all kind of like a moral. I mean, I don't know. I sometimes wonder with baseball, they ever argue about whether it's like a moral record or a record. Who else? So Jay had a question. Does
right.
Alexis, do you have a question or?
You can go to the people who have their hands up.
Okay. Let's see. We got Jay and Aaron. Jay, why don't you go? I think you had yours first. Come on, come on, turn yourself on.
I'm here. I just wanted to in particular start off by thanking Alexis for sharing that story, and it's sobering to hear how far behind, I guess, baseball is from what I would have guessed. I guess that's maybe out of ignorance of how the world of the gender change within professional sports. I mean, my first question is it the case that baseball is behind other sports? And if so, why is that? And what does that mean for pathways forward?
I mean, I would say, unfortunately, baseball is actually not behind. I don't know if anybody saw yesterday, women who worked for the Washington football team were at Capitol Hill participating in a roundtable hosted by the Oversight Committee. And they are literally just asking for transparency and accountability, which is a part of what I was asking for through specific policies, but they're not even there yet. So the lawyer, thankfully, that accompanied me to speak to Major League Baseball, she also is a lawyer for the women who worked for the Washington football team, and she met with the deputy commissioner and the director of baseball operations for Major League Baseball with me, and she said, if this was the NFL, this doesn't happen. You don't get to A, get a meeting. You don't get to B, meet with a high level executive, and you don't get them to agree to do what you're asking them to do. So as base level as these policy proposals are, and as disappointing as it might be that these have to start so far back, unfortunately, baseball is ahead of other sports. I would say that there's a lot of room for improvement. And I guess, can compare those directly because I have that kind of connection. But I would say that, yeah, other sports are not doing very well. I mean, we see it even in kind of like the pay disparity in women and men's sports. We see it in a lot of ways. And I just think there's a long, long way to go.
How's hockey doing, Alexis? I mean, since as a Canadian,
I would say it's not that much better. I wish it was. Hockey's also very super white, more than some other sports. So, I mean, there are there are problems abound. And I think it's because, we love sports so much. I mean, you brought up kind of the issues. I mean, Roger Clemens, Barry Bonds, the moral issues. And I mean, I think you asked if that was a conversation. That is a very widespread conversation that I see a lot of discourse about. And I mean, there are off the field issues, not besides PEDs, issues with women, issues with domestic violence, issues with other things that are being talked about now, but they are being questioned. And it is very unclear where some people stand on some of those issues. So I think we do have a lot of room for improvement.
Okay. Yeah, historians, or I think that's probably what Japheth was talking about. Historians are probably very bad people to ask about this question of revising records. It's like historians, like the record is the record, and the idea that because you find out somebody took some steroids, that you're going to go back and change the record. It's like, well, no, it happened, right? Whatever happened, it happened. Is a historian's point of view. So Aaron and Thomas. Aaron Holmes, are you there? Aaron seems to be frozen. Thomas, you want to go?
Yeah, so Tommy, I have a question. I'm not going to pass up the pun opportunity. I don't know if this is too inside baseball, but and this is, coming from somebody who knows a little bit about baseball and absolutely zip about the law. But thinking about how arbitration sort of addressed the issue of the reserve clause, like, did the introduction of arbitration shift the legal conversation or shift the legal battleground about sort of free and fair contracts in baseball? And is that in any way distracting us from thinking about the antitrust exemption? Or kind of alternately, how would addressing the antitrust exemption sort of also address the kind of like the weird inequities that exist within the arbitration process, which seems, it just seems sort of so easily corruptible or manipulable?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, it's probably beyond the scope of the time that we have to explain the way that antitrust law intersects with labor law in this country. Although it's a fascinating story.
We're all already home.
But here's what I can say. So, there are ways in which the fact that baseball enjoys the antitrust exemption continue to exert a lot of pressures on the labor environment in baseball. I think most notably the recent allegations, which I think aggravated the current unease by the Players Association about whether teams were colluding to hold down free agent salaries in the previous couple of off seasons has loomed large in the current CBA round of CBA talks. But as a formal matter, I think you're right. So the genius of Marvin Miller was the first thing he asked for when he really got some teeth into the owners was for arbitration and to get an independent arbitrator rather than having the commissioner himself serve as the arbitrator, which is, for example, how things work in the NFL. So if you followed the recent lawsuit by the former head coach of the Miami Dolphins, Brian Flores, I've got a lot of thoughts about that lawsuit, but I think the likeliest thing that's going to happen is that he's going to be forced into arbitration on many of those claims where they'll be heard by a decidedly non-neutral arbitrator in the form of Roger Goodell. That's not the case with baseball, in part because Marvin Miller was able to win that key concession from the owners. And there's a quote that I love that I couldn't fit into my talk. I wanted to save time, but the negotiator for the league side once said of Marvin Miller that he wouldn't accept Christ Almighty as an arbitrator if he didn't think he was neutral. So that really was the first step, and then it was the Messerschmitt and McNally decision that established the teeth that arbitration could have. So I think that the arbitration process has been extremely revolutionary in baseball, and I think it explains part of why baseball has seen more labor gains than other professional sports. But I think there's lots of antitrust issues that remain in the shadow of the fact of the exemption.
Wow. Okay. So
can
Aaron,
I just add to,
go ahead. Oh, sure, Japheth. Go ahead and speak, Japheth.
Yeah, I'd like to add just a little bit to that, and that how masterful Marvin Miller was in a long-term game plan. Wasn't just getting arbitration and getting the reserve clause struck down through arbitration. But then at that point, it looked like, well, everybody's going to be a free agent after the end of the year, after they play out everyone will just play out their reserve year. And then we'll have everyone in the major leagues will be a free agent. And he was able to then sell the owners on what looked like a compromise that you had to have 6 years of service before you became a free agent, which the owners were more than happy to go along with right off the top, without realizing that kept the supply of talented players reaching a free agency limited every year, and would be upward on player salaries. And that doesn't become evident and really until the early 1980s. Marvin Miller was playing three-dimensional chess here a little bit.
I'm sorry I couldn't be in my office for this talk because I have a Marvin Miller baseball card that I keep in my office.
Oh.
I thought you were going to say you had a Marvin Miller
Professor Bennett
chess set. So Aaron Holmes.
Thank you all for this talk. I'm going to preface my comment with my Zoom app seems to know exactly when I need to be using it, and that's when it cuts out. So I'll apologize if I'm a little shaky. It was doing this yesterday while I was trying to teach, which was even greater. I really enjoyed all three of your talks, but my question is specifically for Tommy and Alexis. And I'm thinking about kind of the struggles to regulate professional baseball. And on the one hand, there's seems to be a great willingness to regulate them from the top down when it comes to big sweeping things, and then an unwillingness to interfere at these seemingly smaller issues that are much more significant, I think, to individuals. And I'm kind of struck by the similarities, and you'll have to forgive me. The only like metaphor I've ever found for explaining the academic job market to my parents was like in explaining it like Major League Baseball, where you have free agents and those are adjuncts and they go around, and there's time you put in the minor leagues and all of these things. And I'm wondering what kind of lessons we can take from the efforts to either regulate baseball, to deal with questions of sexual harassment and labor inequality that are also rife in other fields. I'm thinking of academia, but in others as well. What kinds of lessons can we take away from this big project, it seems, to try to figure out how we regulate baseball for those of us who are not in the major leagues? Hopefully that all went through.
Alexis, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I mean, I think from my perspective, you have to convince people to care first and foremost, which is a really difficult task, especially when, I mean, status quo is what is desired. There are obviously, I mean, we see it now in the negotiations for the CBA, like the things that the owners seem to be discussing are just like pulling back so that they can get right back to status quo after they give something up. And so for me, I mean, the reason I think they even heard me out on this in the first place, and the reason I got to talk to some teams as well, was because there were a whole bunch of articles written about this last year. It was relevant in the moment. And then now kind of that momentum is gone. So I think they kind of are like, why should we care about this? This doesn't seem to be a problem. If there's not an article being written every day by The Athletic about new people coming forward about Mickey Callaway, then who cares? What's happening here? Jared Porter is falling off the face of the earth. So the problems look like they're gone. And so it's really hard to kind of get people to care and then to continually push for change. And so I think, I mean, the bigger problem between finding a way to regulate is finding people who want to regulate and giving them reasons to do it. It's hard when it's like people need to have a daughter to care, or they need to have an excuse, or they need to hear my story so that they listen to me. And I struggle with that, and I am becoming more willing to talk about it because I do think it is the only way that people are willing to start to talk about change and why it's needed. And so, I mean, I wish I had some answers, but I think the same way that people kind of, mention that like what I'm proposing is very elementary, this is very base level. We are really nowhere. We need to start at the bottom. We need to just get people to listen, get people to care. I mean, even yesterday, I know I mentioned the oversight committee, and a lot of the members of the committee were like, why should we care about this? This isn't something that should be talked about on Capitol Hill. And the women who were there were like, somebody has to listen at some point, so we'll take what we can get. And I feel like that's kind of really where we are, which is unfortunate, but hopefully it is a starting point, and maybe Professor Bennett has a better answer, but that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I certainly would endorse everything Alexis said. The only thing I would add is that as I observe the way that professional sports have developed, the only thing that's been successful in changing the power balance is cooperation and solidarity. And I think you can see that on the team side, right? So it wasn't until commissioners were able to arrogate to themselves centralized power that allowed them to kind of run point for all of the teams and tamp down on any competition among them, that the teams were able to gain economic power. I think you see the same thing on the union side. It wasn't until Marvin Miller and the MLBPA were able to point in the same direction that they were able to achieve significant gains. And I think in places where there haven't been gains, perhaps including academia, that's not something for me to comment on, as I am not yet a free agent or achieved tenure status. The same kind of dynamic obtains.
So what's the baseball equivalent of tenure?
Well, that would be the dream of free agency. I think that's 6+ years of service time.
It's like
tenure clocks and arbitration clocks are just about the same length.
I think tenure is when they make you pitching coach or something. I don't know, or third base coach. But
after you get your 10 years of service time, it's that pension, I think, you can live off.
So we had one more question. Bill Thompson, do you want to ask yours?
I was interested in how quickly the Negro Leagues dissolved after Robinson broke the barrier, the color barrier. Did they just disappear quickly, or over a number of years, or how quickly did that go?
So at the time, there were two Negro Major Leagues. There was the Negro National League and the Negro American League. The Negro National League folds after 1948. That's the last Negro League World Series. Several of the teams fold, and a few of them get folded into the Negro American League, which continues on until about 1960, but there are very few teams. There's nowhere near the quality of play. It had been that, star players were also like a part of the community, and they would hang around. A lot of them would spend their whole careers with one team. By the early 1950s, you have Negro League teams basically being used as farm clubs. So you're breaking that connection to the cities and your fan base. The quality of player you're putting up is nowhere near as good. Younger kind of prospects, older players that are too old to have their contracts sold or just losing their jobs. And so you're losing a lot of that fan base that is now rooting for major league teams. The Monarchs leave Kansas City in '54. They will continue to play as a barnstorming team until about 1965. They're one of the last two teams left with the Indianapolis Clowns and the Negro American League. But the whole thing just sort of fizzles out. It really ends with more of a whimper than anything else. It's hard even finding dates of these teams' last games and when they folded. A lot of them were kind of sold off for spare parts and their equipment and stuff. So it's more of a fizzle out than distinctively ends one day. But it's not long after Jackie Robinson. The best year for the Negro Leagues ever had were 1945 and 46. And by 1948, you have a whole league folding. So that gives you some indication of how fast these changes were being made.
Thanks. And what's interesting, I grew up in Chillicothe and actually saw both the Monarchs and the Indianapolis team in the 60s, I'm guessing, in late 50s or early 60s.
Well, they were the two left, and they barnstormed a lot together.
Yeah.
The Clowns were a little bit problematic in their kind of show that they put on. There was a little bit of a Jim Crow element to them that got criticism.
Right.
But yeah, they were the two last teams, and if you got to see two teams playing in, say, 1960, it was likely to have been them. They started just touring together, so each team had somebody to play.
And that may have been what it was. It may have been they playing each other.
Well, it's probably like the kind of thing that, I don't know, the Harlem Globetrotters, right? Where it's like
right
entertainment show that goes around to small towns.
Right.
So
well,
David,
and the Monarchs have some connections to them.
Do they really? Well, so this makes me wonder, Japheth, whether there isn't like a thing you or somebody needs to do about the integration of the minor leagues. Because I know Jackie Robinson was put in minor league teams, but I wonder how widespread it was, where there was a similar thing like you were talking about, where it's just a few cherry picked players, or where there's a larger scale integration that takes place. We can talk about that ourselves, though, probably. He's gone. Well, any other final questions? Well, if not, let me just think. I think we've gotten a lot of comment. I've got a lot of comments through the chat here, some publicly, some privately, but what a great session this was. So I guess people like sports. But it's also, this really turned out well, despite the technical difficulties, despite the fact we couldn't all be together. So it makes me think there should be a baseball panel every year. And hopefully Tommy can back me up on that. But thank you. Great, Alexis, great to meet you. Thanks, Tommy. And thank you, Japheth, wherever you are. And let's I'm going to actually what I'm going to do is we're going to say goodbye. I'm going to turn the recording off, and then if anyone wants to chat afterwards, we can do that too.